I'm going to start off here with by introducing Mark Metzler. He's going to talk about the parachutes, and I'm going to read a little bio before each speaker that they've provided. Mark Metzler is an active skydiver with over 50 years of parachuting experience. He holds a United States Parachute Association Class D, which is an expert parachute license, which required both night and water jumps. So he's one tough dude. Mark also has extensive experience jumping military surplus parachute gear similar to the type that D.B. Cooper used on that fateful night. In 2006, Mark jumped from the rear air stair door of a DC-9 passenger jet unpressurized at 14,500 feet. DC-9, for those of you who are not familiar, is very similar to the 727. Mark's diverse career path includes skippering commercial fishing vessels and practicing as a criminal defense attorney. He earned a Bachelor of Science in Electrical Engineering degree from UC Berkeley and has designed patented electronic circuits for implantable medical devices. Mark is an aviation history buff who finds air mysteries such as Amelia Earhart's disappearance and D.B. Cooper's case absolutely fascinating. So, having said that, let me introduce Mark Metzler here, and he'll give you some information about the parachutes.
Thank you, Eric. Before we start, I think we all owe a debt of gratitude to Eric Ullis's generous spirit and gracious nature. He has personally funded this event and made it 100% free for everybody, which is quite something and deeply appreciated. I want to say in the beginning here that there'll be two types of presentations here, suspect-focused and physical evidence focused. Mine will be much more in the latter category. I will not name specific suspects or candidates, as I prefer to call them. And the other person who will be presenting objective scientific evidence and who also will not refer to particular suspects because I don't think he has a favorite is Tom Kay, who's done, which to me as an engineer is very impressive work on physical evidence that he found on the tie that was left on the airplane. The FBI is certain it's Cooper's tie, and I tend to agree with them. I think the chances of that having belonged to some other passenger, all of which could have been interviewed after the flight, and probably were. I don't think any of them left it, and I don't think it was there from a prior flight. And the FBI, with all their scientific sophistication, didn't do much with the tie. Tom not only looked at it with optical microscopy, he has a personally owned and maintained scanning electron microscope in his garage and did some really interesting work, and later in collaboration with some other people, spectroscopic analysis, and he found some fascinating things about what was on the tie. And he'll speak, I won't steal his thunder, but pay close attention to his talk because I think eventually that evidence will be used to confirm who was actually D.B. Cooper. I'm 69 years old. I made my first parachute jump at the age of 18. Had it been done my way, it would have been done at age 12, which was my age when I first saw up close and personal freefall skydiving. My parents were taking me and my three brothers on a camping vacation, and we just happened to stop at a drop zone, and I was hooked, I was enthralled. My brothers wanted to leave and get up to the lake, and I begged my parents to stay there. And I got to talk to real skydivers. I could actually see them free falling from the planes and opening their parachutes, and I just said, I have to do this. And my parents were like free-range child rearing philosophy. They would happily have signed any waiver, and they told the drop zone that, but they said, there's so much worry about liability that we don't train anyone under 18. Well, almost to the day I turned 18, I trained, and I've been jumping ever since. My experience includes jumping the type of military surplus parachute gear that D.B. Cooper jumped. And the reason wasn't any particular interest in making, historically significant jumps of, World War II and early post-war parachute gear. Was because I couldn't afford anything better. And like today, a full parachute rig with a main and reserve canopy and all the accessories, the harness, the container, you're looking at close to $8,000. And back in '68 when I started, it wasn't $8,000, but it was much more than a college student could afford. So what I did is I found a complete military surplus parachute rig, which included the main and the reserve, for $75, and that was just a hell of a bargain. The gear is very rugged, very reliable, but the bad thing about it is it lets you down really fast. And every landing in that thing was a bone crusher. And it's a miracle I didn't break anything. And the reason, I found out, I wondered why that was. And I found out that the military did that purposely because different pilots have different weights. And if they do a simultaneous ejection or exit from a distress aircraft, you want them to land close enough to each other that they can assist each other and possibly avoid enemy capture and arrange for rescue. And so you want them to have a minimal dwell time coming down, because the longer they're exposed to winds aloft, and if they have different weights in the same parachutes, they're going to end up in different places. So they put it right at the edge of comfort, and it was on the wrong side of comfort. We had to do what's called parachute landing falls, and you've probably seen them in the paratrooper Zoom, where you roll the landing. And it wasn't just to look good or feel authentic. If you didn't do that, you'd break a leg, an ankle, a hip, or something. The main question is, did D.B. Cooper survive the jump? The FBI would have had the public believe that he did not. The early public announcements they made it sound like the jump was almost certainly fatal, that you couldn't jump from a jet airliner. There would be physiological consequences, spins, disorientation, and followed by death, impact under an unopened parachute. Well, it turns out that's just flat out wrong. It's not true. The jump was very survivable, and I will go into the reasons why that's my opinion. The instructions D.B. Cooper gave to the crew tell you a lot about what he knew, or at least that's my opinion. He didn't just say, open the door. He said, I want to fly unpressurized. I want the altitude to be below 10,000 feet. I want the landing gear down, and I want 15 degrees of flaps. Now, most people who are not involved in aviation don't know the difference between a flap, an elevator, a spoiler, or a leading edge device. Well, he knew that flaps were the operative deployable airfoil shaping element here that would ensure that the flight would stay slow enough so that he could have a stable and survivable exit. And by having the plane fly unpressurized, he knew that they couldn't render him unconscious by secretly nursing the plane up to 18 or 20,000 feet, because the flight attendants did not have oxygen masks, and it would have been obvious if they had put them on. And they didn't want to risk any harm to them, so that would keep him at altitudes probably below, he insisted on 10,000 feet, which was a good number. That's what I would have insisted on. It's enough to clear the hills and mountains, and low enough so that you're not getting into the hypoxic range, which is generally between, pilots and physiologists differ on their opinions, but generally oxygen should be thought about and probably used in above 12,000, 16,000. I've made jumps without oxygen from 18,000 feet and with oxygen from 24,000 feet. And so I think Cooper wisely gave a bunch of commands to the flight crew that not only assured that the maximum chance of a successful jump, but also indicated some detailed knowledge about aircraft in general, and perhaps even about 727s. I was a third-year engineering student at UC Berkeley when the shocking news hit about this amazing skyjacking. I mean, people had been taking airliners to Cuba and so forth, but they stayed aboard, and they would demand that they be taken to a country that might be friendly to radicals or whoever was skyjacking the plane. But every one of the skyjackers prior to Cooper landed with the plane. It was just mind-blowing to me and to my skydiver colleagues that someone jumped out of a 727. We thought, how in the world did this guy know you could exit? You would think that a rational design of a 727 wouldn't allow the pressure bulkhead door to be opened in flight, nor would it allow the rear air stairs to be deployed, because they're essentially almost like a big elevator element, and would cause a pitch down in the aircraft, so you'd have to have a pretty good reason to want any of those things to happen while the plane was aloft. And also, being an aviation nut, I've got a lot of aircraft manuals. Every passenger jet airliner and most business jets have something called squat switches. And the squat switches are actuated by the landing gear struts. If you notice, you even see when landing gear hit the surface, you'll see a compression, and the strut compresses, absorbs a lot of the shock of contact in the runway, and then comes back up, and when the plane's at rest, it's more compressed than it is after the wheels leave the ground, because then the weight of the aircraft isn't on the struts. And they have micro switches that can tell the systems on the plane, are we on the ground or are we aloft? And you use those switches to inhibit or to enable various things. So for example, you wouldn't want, let's say a pilot is distracted and thinks he's raising flaps and actually pulls the landing gear retraction lever on the aircraft while it's on the ground. Well, without the squat switch, the gear would come up and the aircraft would be ruined. It would contact the ground. So the squat switch prevents things like that from happening. And it's used conversely. The squat switches are used to prevent thrust reversers from being deployed in most aircraft until the airplane's on the ground. In fact, they arm thrust reversers and wingtop lift spoilers so that the minute the squat switch, the compression of the strut shows that the airplane has contacted the ground, those are instantly deployed. And you'll see that happen if you look out on the wing. The minute the struts compress, you'll see those wingtop lift spoilers pop up. So we thought, with all that, how did Cooper know he could get out of that aircraft? Well, it turns out Boeing had done flight tests for the US government. I believe it was for the CIA, but I'm not certain what agency it was for. And the flight tests were designed to demonstrate that the Boeing 727 could, without modifications, be used for successful airdrops of cargo and personnel. You can imagine that might be useful in situations where, for example, airliners are often granted permission to fly over even hostile countries. You know, like when Cuba was very hostile to the United States, they still accepted air traffic over their country. And if you could have an airliner, especially at night, drop equipment or personnel undetected, that would be a tremendous tactical advantage, and I think that's what it was used for. But nobody knew that. I didn't know it. Cooper knew it, I think. And here's my reasoning. If Cooper didn't know with absolute certainty that he could get out of that 727 when it was aloft, he was entering an aluminum jail cell. It would deliver him to an airport where law enforcement would be waiting and take him into custody. So he had to know that he could get out of that airplane. And I think that narrows the field of possible Coopers significantly. There weren't too many people who knew about that program, but there were some. People who worked at Boeing flight tests knew about it. People who worked in technical documentation knew about it. And there was even a very obscure article in a British flight magazine that showed a 727 dropping, I believe, boxes. So, but I never saw it and I never knew about it. So we have Cooper knowing about 727s, knowing that he could get out of one, and knowing enough about parachute gear that when it was delivered to him on the plane, the FBI was worried. They're worried about two things. Cooper very smartly, showing considerable cunning, asked for 2 backs and 2 front parachutes. Those are not terms used by skydivers. They refer to them as main and reserve rigs or back and chest rigs. By asking for essentially 2 complete sets of gear, it indicated, and he was successful in getting them to think this, that he would be taking one of the crew with him, probably a stewardess. So that discouraged them from sabotaging any of the rigs. And he was delivered, I think accidentally. One of the reserves wasn't jumpable. It was a training reserve that was not airworthy. And, but the 2 back rigs, which I think were, for all practical purposes, identical to the large parachute over there, they were operational and I think were used in the jump. Cooper declined the instructions. He didn't even look at them. He said, I don't need those. And there's another thing that's a controversial piece of information, but Richard Tosaw, who's a retired FBI agent, he's deceased now, and also a lawyer, he's a pretty sharp guy, said that Tina Mucklow, the flight attendant who had the most prolonged contact with Cooper, witnessed him taking packing cards out of the parachutes. Now, most non-jumpers don't even know what a packing card is. A packing card is a written record. It's folded on a small piece of tear-resistant paper, waterproof paper. And the riggers who inspect and pack the rigs put their license number and their name and the date upon which the inspection occurred, any discrepancies noted, repairs noted, and repack certified. And if that's true, I think it shows Cooper was somehow involved with parachutes. Maybe not a skydiver, he could have been a rigger, he could have been a military air crew, but he knew how to put the rig on, and I think he knew how to deploy it correctly. And you should remember that the people who use these kind of rigs, this is not a paratrooper rig, this is an emergency rig that's used in ejection seats, and it's also used for manual exits from cargo aircraft that are in distress and do not have ejection seats. But do any of the people who get emergency rigs get any actual jump training? The answer is no, they don't. They're shown how to pull the ripcord. They're told to get clear of the aircraft, pull the ripcord, and everything will work out fine. So it didn't take any particular special skill to get out of the aircraft and pull the ripcord. I think Cooper may have been a very experienced parachutist, but he needn't have been. He may have had only flight crew experience in the Air Force or the Navy, and from that he would know how to put on the rig. He would know about packing cards probably, and he would know how to pull the ripcord. So when you summarize all of this, it narrows the funnel, or the focus of where you would look for likely D.B. Coopers. I think you look for people who had some familiarity with aircraft. I think you look for people who may have been air crew. This is quite different from paratrooper rigs. Paratroopers don't do free fall, they don't pull ripcords. It's a completely different kind of jumping, but that doesn't mean a paratrooper couldn't have made the jump. The fact that he asked for front chutes is a little puzzling, because you wouldn't really need one on this jump. Your chances of even recognizing a main chute malfunction and cutting away from it and then opening your reserve parachute at night, it's just probably not going to happen. And also, he didn't ask, or he didn't tell the FBI what kind of back rigs to deliver, but what they ended up delivering don't even have attachment points for the reserve. There's no way this reserve can be securely fastened to the main parachute. They don't have something called D-rings. And the reserve parachute, I'll show it to you, has clips on the back. These clips clip right into D-rings, and the opening's too small to stuff webbing into. You know, you'd think, well, maybe he could just take the webbing on the main parachute and stuff them in there and get a good connection, but that's not possible. They're sized to just barely fit around the D-ring diameters. So they're essentially useless on that jump, but maybe he never intended to use them as emergency, second chance parachutes. I've had to use those 2 times. I have been jumping since 1968. I stopped logging jumps after my 500th jump, and so I estimate I have well over 1,000 jumps by now. And 2 times my main parachute has failed, and I had to cut away and use that chest reserve. But on any particular jump, your chances are really good just having 1 parachute. And in fact, the military only gives reserve parachutes to special ops who are doing free fall jumps and to paratroopers. The emergency rigs only have 1 canopy. There is no plan B. Plan A has to work. Without naming any particular suspects, I think we've narrowed the areas of probable search, where you're likely to find some good suspects. Now, the FBI, said this jump was almost certainly fatal, but look at the actual facts. There were a number of jumpers subsequent, they're copycat jumpers, who hijacked planes, demanded ransom, and jumped, and all but 1 lived. And the one who lived, the one who didn't live, the one who died, was an unfortunate guy in the Philippines who designed and built his own parachute, reportedly out of bed sheets. And the poor guy, he actually exited the airplane, and when he opened it, disintegrated, and he fell to his death. The stresses involved in parachute opening are pretty severe. And in fact, all the sport gear I have has a placard on it And it specifies maximum opening speeds between 125 and 150 miles per hour, most of them 150. Going a little bit over that actually is dangerous. The stresses on a parachute don't go up linearly. Like 200 miles an hour isn't twice the stress of 100 miles an hour. It goes up as a square of velocity, so it's 4 times the stress at 200 miles an hour. And most of these things don't have a safety margin that big. So had you picked some other kind of parachute and exited at a speed higher than 150 miles an hour, there's a good chance you would damage the parachute on opening. So probably just by good luck, D.B. Cooper had either, it's hard to say for sure, the records conflict on this. Bruce Smith, who's in the audience here, has done a lot of really useful work in tracking down the provenance of these parachutes and what they were likely to be and who packed them and who owned them. And I think we can say with certainty that it was either an NB6 or an NB8 harness and container, and they only differ in size. The construction's identical. And the canopy was either a 28-foot C9 emergency canopy, or it was a Navy 26-foot conical. Both of them are just absolute pit bulls of parachutes. They make the sport parachutes look like just weak, flimsy things. In sport round parachutes, the suspension lines are attached to the skirt of the canopy, the bottom, the part that runs around circumferentially at the bottom. In these parachutes, in the NB6 contained one, which is actually, there is no such thing as an NB6 or an NB8 parachute. It just describes a container. The NB6 container usually had a 26-foot Navy conical, which had a smaller pack volume, and the larger NB8 container contained a 28-foot C9 canopy. Both of them had this amazing construction where the suspension lines go up from the jumper all the way up and sewed into the canopy fabric, over the top and all the way back down the other side with no break in the line. And they had, in the C9, there were 28 of those, in the Navy 26-foot conical, there were 26 of them. So it had incredibly strong structure and could survive just about anything. I mean, it could survive probably a 500 mile an hour opening. And I think in some cases in ejections from jets, it did survive openings like that. So all D.B. Cooper had to do was correctly put on the rig and fasten it, get to the bottom of the stairs, and if he just faced forward with his back facing, towards the rear, and pulled the ripcord, the pilot chute, which is a spring-loaded small parachute, would have popped out, caught the airstream. It would have dragged the main parachute out of the canopy, which would then pull him off the stairs, and it would have been a controlled opening with virtually no risk at all of going into a spin. Jumpers, including me, have gone into spins, but if you're jumping during the daytime and you have a good visual horizon and some landmark that you can use to tell if you're turning one way or the other, you can stabilize yourself, you can get out of the spin. At night, especially on a cloudy night and a dark night without lights on the ground, it's not so sure that you would get out of that spin. And a spin can go really wrong really fast. And the reason I know that is when I trained for free fall parachuting, there were no tandem jumps, they didn't exist. There was no assisted free fall where instructors would be next to you holding onto you. They basically threw the kid out of the airplane and said, figure it out. And I was taught that if I got into a spin, give it 2 seconds and then pull no matter what, because the spin will accelerate, and before you know it, the blood will centrifuge into your head and you'll black out, and that's the last memory you'll ever have for the rest of your life. So in learning how to get stable in free fall, I went into spins, and fortunately, obviously I lived through them. In several cases I had to just pull, and even though I was tumbling wildly, the parachute opened and didn't tangle with me. And in the other cases I was able to arrest the spin by getting my body more symmetrical. So I don't think Cooper went into a spin and augured in. If he had any knowledge about parachuting at all, he would have done the smart thing and just pulled off the steps. And interestingly, Southern Air Transport, which was a CIA cover airline, Air America is the better known one. Southern Air Transport during the Vietnam War demonstrated 727 airdrops of both personnel and cargo over Korat, Thailand. And the jumper exits were static line exits, and from that, if anybody knew about that, if Cooper knew about those, he would immediately see that that's the best way to do it. The static line deploys the parachute immediately, and the free fall equivalent of that would be to, as soon as you exit the plane, or even before you exit the plane, pull the ripcord. Don't expose yourself to free fall at night without visual references. So, did Cooper know about these jumps in Southeast Asia? I can't answer that question, but they did exist, and there's some who think that they were used for covert air operations over Vietnam. I actually don't think that's the case. I'm one who shies away from, the deep state, the dark cover, the conspiracy theories. They didn't really need to have any covert airdrops over Vietnam. They had very capable aircraft, and they didn't need to masquerade as airliners. I mean, they were flying B-52s over North Vietnam, so being secret really wasn't much point in it. So I think Cooper survived the jump, unless, and this is about the only unless I have, unless he went into the Columbia River. I think if you went into that river at night in water more than 4 or 5 feet deep, death would almost be certain. I've made 2 water jumps. I've made a number of night jumps. I've never made a night water jump, and the reason I haven't, it's just too dangerous. Even if you had chase boats, the chances of things going wrong really fast and being unrecoverable are just too great. So I think the chances of going to the Columbia River, you can actually figure it out. It occupies a known square footage of land. You can calculate that and look at the percentage it is of the total area where Cooper was likely to have landed. And it's a very, very unlikely event that he went into the Columbia. But if he did, everything I'm saying about it being a survivable jump is off. I'd just like to talk in general about the D.B. Cooper world. I'm fascinated with aviation, especially aviation mysteries. The Amelia Earhart disappearance, the Malaysia Air 777 that's yet to be found. And there are many long-standing aviation mysteries. But to me, the most compelling is the D.B. Cooper mystery. We just have no idea who he was. There are many people who claim they were Cooper. There are many people who could have been Cooper. There's people who have a ton of circumstantial evidence tying them to the crime, but no proof that they were on the airplane. And with my background in law, and I practiced criminal defense for a long time, nobody today could be convicted of the crime. If I represented D.B. Cooper, I'm very, very confident that I could get a dismissal prior to trial, and if I couldn't get that, I could get an acquittal. And the reason I believe that, and let me preface this with just a short anecdote. When I was starting out in criminal law, I did an internship in the public defender's office in Oakland, California, as representing junkies and hookers and thugs, and it was just, and I enjoyed it. It was, once in a while you get an innocent client, and it was incredibly gratifying to get them released out of custody. But in one case where I got this guy who was about to stand trial for a burglary, they had done an illegal search, and I got the search suppressed. And with all the material evidence gone in the case, they had to immediately release him from custody. And so I'm walking out of the courtroom, and the arresting officer's following me with a look in his eye, and I was actually a little scared. I thought I just ruined his case. He comes up to me, he puts a hand on me, and I was really thinking he was going to punch me. And instead he shakes my hand, he says, "Nice job, kid." He said, most lawyers get jaded, they don't try that hard. You did a really good job in there. Don't worry about me, I'll get this guy back. 6 or 8 months, he'll screw up again, and I'll get him with a better case. And he said, "But let me give you a piece of advice." He said, "You're going to be in this game for a while. Don't assume that you know criminals just based on what you see in this courtroom." He said, "There's a subset out there of more intelligent, more clever, more resourceful people." And he said, they don't see the inside of a jail or a courtroom, and they keep my job really, really interesting. So I think D.B. Cooper is in that subset. I think he's, he probably doesn't have a criminal record. Doesn't mean he didn't commit crimes, he just didn't get caught. And I would move to dismiss the case against D.B. Cooper based on the FBI's loss of the cigarette butts. The prosecution is obligated to preserve and disclose to the defendant all evidence, not cherry-picked evidence that just points to guilt, but all evidence, including exculpatory evidence that would tend to prove innocence. The loss of those cigarette butts, to me, is almost incredible. And I wonder if they actually did lose them, or that's a story to get people to think they are lost and then be more casual about DNA and fingerprints and so forth. The FBI, I've been up against them in a number of cases. They are the most careful people I've ever seen in chain of custody and evidence preservation. They know that if they screw up there, they're jeopardizing a prosecution, and they're very well trained. I can't conceive of them getting rid of those cigarette butts. And I would argue that they could potentially have exculpatory DNA evidence on them or exculpatory fingerprint evidence on them, and I would move for a dismissal. And unless the government could come up with other material evidence that made that cigarette butt stuff immaterial, such as they find the defendant with stacks and stacks of Chris Cooper serial number $20 bills. Now, they couldn't compel my client to testify, but if they introduced those in court and I had no evidence showing that they were obtained legally, I think a jury would convict. So without Chris 20s, I think the chance of a defendant being convicted are close to zero. And even if they wouldn't dismiss the case pre-trial, I'd be entitled to a jury instruction, which is applicable in cases where the prosecution has lost possibly material evidence. The jury instruction basically says that the jury can infer evidence that is basically the worst possible for the prosecution. So they can infer, if it's missing, they can infer that it was exculpatory, that it had DNA that doesn't match or fingerprints that don't match. And that's the punishment and the deterrent to keep the government from losing evidence that it should be preserved and disclosed to comply with the constitutional due process and fair trial requirements. So in closing, I think Cooper survived the jump. I don't know who he is. I have some idea about what his experience and skills were. And actually, I do think he will be found someday. I think events like this keep the legend alive and serve a very valuable purpose. If events like this and books and new Cooper candidates didn't come up, people would forget about who Cooper was. And if they forget about who Cooper was, some kid finding a stack of 20s or a parachute rig that's all muddy and has a packing card in it that has Earl Cossey's name on it as a rigger, they wouldn't know what it meant. They would sell it on eBay or pocket the money, and they would not realize it had any possible connection to D.B. Cooper. So I'm very grateful to Eric for putting this on and grateful to you for your obvious interest in the case. And I hope during my remaining lifetime, which I hope is at least 20 years, I'm 69 years old, we'll find out who D.B. Cooper was, because we have physical evidence and we know there was a Cooper. A lot of people think, oh, it was an airline crew conspiracy. There was no D.B. Cooper. They split up the money. That's obviously not true. And so Cooper exists or existed. He may be dead by now, but I am confident someday we will know who he was. Are there any questions? Yes.
If the FBI did truly lose the cigarette butts, I would think the DNA would be too old for male DNA to extract and get a positive DNA sample for a suspect if they even come up with one.
I don't know enough about DNA. My training is electrical engineering and no wet science, so I'd have to have somebody else answer that question. I just don't know. But generally, if there's any controversy about that, it's construed against the party who lost the evidence.
I have a question.
Yes.
So the lead FBI investigator lives here in Portland, and I went to his house a couple of years ago. Does anybody remember his name? Because and has anybody contacted him? Because he's here and he talks. Just as a note.
He's actually lives in a remote location and he's got Alzheimer's.
He lives near his family in Woodburn. His name is Ralph Himmelsbach.
Yeah.
He wasn't the lead FBI investigator, by the way. He just was the grunt guy from the Portland office. Seattle handled the investigation.
But I talked to Ralph Himmelsbach. He kind of held himself out as the lead investigator, even if that wasn't the case. And I asked him about whether there was any evidence that Tina Mucklow saw D.B. Cooper pulling the packing card out of the rig. And I challenge you to find the packing card in that big rig. It's not easy to find. And he said there was absolutely no evidence of that. And every question he answered with absolute authority, like there is no other version of the truth. What I say is the truth. And he didn't say I was in charge, but he sure implied it.
One other quick question. So it's rumored that Tina, the flight attendant, became a nun and then she left the nunnery and lives now in Medford. Has anybody talked to her?
Yes.
She's
She lives in Eugene.
And there was another question?
Oh, yeah. Speaking of DNA evidence, this is for any expert here. Whatever happened to the chair? Didn't they take his seat out of the plane and send it off to some vast warehouse somewhere around Quantico? What?
They did remove the seat. I don't know what tests were done to it. We've been reading all the Freedom of Information Act reports that have been released from the FBI, and I've not seen anything about the chair other than it was taken out from Reno.
What kind of follow-up question? He also had 2 drinks, which did the flight attendants try to preserve those cups or those glasses?
I don't know the answer to that, Bruce. Do you know?
There's variable evidence, but it's understood. The prevailing evidence is that he had 1 drink and the cup was retained and fingerprints were taken from it and they got a partial.
Do they still have the cup, though? That's not at 100% confirmed, but that's the leading understanding that we have right now.
What I do know is they had enough skin cells from the tie to exclude but not convict a suspect. There's a partial DNA, so if you were not a match to that, you couldn't be D.B. Cooper, but if you were a match, it didn't mean you were D.B. Cooper. Yes?
On the parachute, is there like foam pieces in there, and is it covered with fire retardant?
I don't know about fire retardant. I believe there is some sort of fire retardant coating on this, but I don't know for a fact. And most military surplus emergency bailout rigs do have a comfort pad on the back. And let's see if this one does. It's hard to tell. I don't think this one has foam, but I have seen ones that do have foam in them, so I know that they do exist.
So there is a possibility.
Absolutely, yes, I've seen them. Any other questions? Yes.
You said 150 miles an hour was the max that you can deploy safely?
Sport parachute.
Oh, sports.
Yeah, these military ones, I think there's evidence of them. I mean, the C9 that's in this one is what was used in the SR-71. So, that's a real fast airplane.
Terminal velocity is 200 miles an hour, right?
Yeah, 120 miles an hour is terminal velocity. In fact, when I jumped out of the DC-9, I had to slow down before I opened my parachute. I had to actually, we exited about 150, 160 miles an hour, and I had to consciously wait and get down to terminal velocity before I deployed. Any other questions? Okay, sorry I took up a little more time than I should have, but thank you, Eric.